So 2016, a couple words first about the vintage. It was a less than normal rainfall, but that doesn't tell the whole story. It's when that rain comes that really has a significant impact on especially the beginning of the growing season each year, and that's kind of what we pay attention to. So that's why whenever you see in a summary of vintage notes, it's usually a pretty important factor. And there are other factors that play a significant importance throughout the growing season as well, depending on their timing. But one of the things that sets the tone is what kind of ground moisture do we have? And we had rains early, and then it was dry for a period of time, and then we had light rains that actually even went late. And so it started out as drier conditions, and then sort of which could have been a year where we had very short shoot growth, but because of the lighter rains throughout the beginning of the growing season, that was mitigated, and we had actually a nice balance in the canopy, and really a good position. And it was a fairly early start to the growing season. And then the summer was relatively cool, and it wasn't until really into September where we had a lot of heat. That has an effect on maturing, and it's a common phenomena here in Napa, and one that I personally try to work around by, for example, pruning very late so we can delay our harvest till we get past that heat, instead of timing the optimal time to harvest when all this heat is happening. And I think we did that pretty successfully in 16. We began harvest basically the last week of September, which is with Merlot, which is fairly late, even though we got an early start. So we had this early start. We had a late beginning of harvest, which equates to what they say longer hang time, which doesn't mean anything in and of itself, because you have to know how you got there. But in any event, it was, I think, a wonderful growing season. We were able to pick and choose the time we wanted to harvest, because we did make it past those hotter days in the early September, and we harvested into October, which was a nice thing. So I'm not going to go over the tasting notes per se of the ampersand, because they're written down there. You can read them, and it's fairly concise and I think explanatory, and you either agree with them or you don't. You can find your own terminology for the expression that's coming out of those wines. But I will just say that we typically make two wines. Our Grand Vin, our top flight wine, is a Levy and McClellan, and then the second wine is the ampersand. And we focus first on putting the Levy McClellan blend together, and it's a wine that we feel has great direction, great focus. It has the greatest expression of terroir. It has the softest tannins, but not always the lowest volume of tannins. It's often a higher volume, higher quantity of very high quality tannins, and that's our goal. We want something that's supple but very long-lived, and it's that quality and quantity of tannins that gives us that. The property is planted to 4 Bordeaux varieties. It's planted 82% to Cabernet Sauvignon, about 12% Cabernet Franc, and 3% each Merlot, and 4% each Merlot, and no, that's right, 3% of Petit Verdot and Merlot. And the ampersand, because we're taking really the wines that fit together in the most cohesive way and the most balanced way with the most expression, we're left with certain lots that are less than that. And one of the ways we're able to craft a wine as a second wine, which the ampersand is, that's pleasurable today and doesn't have tannins that are out of whack, is we're using 10 or 12% Merlot. And typically that's where all of the Merlot will go, is into the ampersand, and it we usually don't use it in the Levy McClellan. Although there have been a few years where we use some, but mostly not. So just as a typical composition of the ampersand, it might be say 80% Cabernet, 10 or 12% Merlot, and then 3 or 4% each Cab Franc and Petit Verdot. Obviously, it varies each year. We don't blend by formula. We blend by result. And then typically the Levy McClellan might be 80 to 85% Cabernet, 10 or 12% Cabernet Franc, which we feel performs really, really well on the property, and 3 or 4% Petit Verdot. So these varieties were planted in the areas on the property where we felt they were best suited. Give you an example, and it has to do a lot with the soil composition, the soil drainability, how well it drains out, the vigor of the site, how much rock is in the content of the soil, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, the Cab Franc was put in an area where, first of all, our soils are almost all volcanic, and they're the similar soils to what you find like up in Howell Mountain, where any of you have visited. They're these reddish clay loam soils that are on top of a white volcanic ash called tufa. And it's very typical for this area because there was a lot of volcanic activity 200, 300,000 years ago. And they're fairly young soils, but they change composition and very much character based on where they were deposited in the valley and what has grown in them over the millennia to contribute to the weathering and to the composition of the soil, both in organic material and drainability. So the Cab Franc is in an area where it's predominantly exposed tufa. So there's very, very little, if any, Aiken clay loam on top. So they're very well-drained soils. They're very low vigor. Cabernet Franc has a more vigorous propensity than Cabernet Sauvignon. This is why we decided to plant it in that particular location. And it was that location that determined ultimately the percentage of the field that was planted, not any preconceived notions on our part. Similarly with the Petit Verdot, it's also a very vigorous growing variety. There was an area where there was a lot of rock exposed, but still some clay loam on top. And that's where we planted the Petit Verdot. And then there are varying degrees of different soil vigor for the Cabernet Sauvignon throughout the property that gives us many different lots or many different picking times that gives us a selection for going into Ampersand or Levy and McClellan.